Chapter 41 of the Pickwick Papers, read by Patty Brugman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Chapter 41. What befell Mr. Pickwick when he got into the Fleet. What prisoners he saw there, and how he passed the night. Mr. Tom Roker, the gentleman who had accompanied Mr. Pickwick into the prison, turned sharp around to the right when he got to the bottom of the little flight of steps, and led the way through an iron gate which stood open, and up another short flight of steps into a long narrow gallery, dirty and low, paved with stone, and very dimly lighted by a window at each remote end. "This," said the gentleman, thrusting his hands into his pockets and looking carelessly over his shoulder to Mr. Pickwick, "this here is the hall flight." "Oh," replied Mr. Pickwick, looking down a dark and filthy staircase, which appeared to lead to a range of damp and gloomy stone vaults beneath the ground. "And those, I suppose, are the little cellars where the prisoners keep their small quantities of coals. Unpleasant places to have to go down to, but very convenient, I dare say." "Yes, I shouldn't wonder if it was convenient," replied the gentleman, "seeing that a few people live there pretty snug. That's the fare, that is." "My friend," said Mr. Pickwick, "you don't really mean to say that human beings live down in those wretched dungeons?" "Don't I?" replied Mr. Roker with indignant astonishment. "Why shouldn't I?" Live down there?" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick. "Live down there, yes, and die down there too, wery often," said Mr. Roker. "And what of that? Who's got to say anything again it? Live down there, yes, and a wery good place it is to live in, ain't it?" As Roker turned somewhat fiercely upon Mr. Pickwick in saying this, and moreover muttered in an excited fashion certain unpleasant invocations concerning his own eyes, limbs, and circulating fluids, the latter gentleman deemed it advisable to pursue the discourse no further. Mr. Roker then proceeded to mount another staircase, as dirty as that which led to the place which had just been the subject of discussion, in which ascent he was closely followed by Mr. Pickwick and Sam. "There," said Mr. Roker, pausing for breath when they reached another gallery of the same dimensions as the one below. "This is the coffee-room flight. The one above's the third, and the one above's that, the top. And the room where you're going to sleep tonight is the warden's room, and it's this way. Come on." Having said all this in a breath, Mr. Roker mounted another flight of stairs, with Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller following at his heels. These staircases received light from sundry windows, placed at some little distance above the floor, and looking into a gravelled area bounded by a high brick wall, with iron chevaux de frise at the top. This area, it appeared from Mr. Roker's statement, was the racket ground, and it further appeared on the testimony of the same gentleman that there was a smaller area in that portion of the prison which was nearest Fardington Street, denominated and called the Painted Ground, from the fact of its walls having once displayed the semblances of various men of war in full sail, and other artistical effects achieved in bygone times by some imprisoned draughtsman in his leisure hours. Having communicated this piece of information, apparently more for the purpose of discharging his bosom of an important fact than with any specific view of enlightening Mr. Pickwick, the guide, having at length reached another gallery, led the way into a small passage at the extreme end, opened a door, and disclosed an apartment of an appearance by no means inviting, containing 8 or 9 iron bedsteads. "There," said Mr. Roker, holding the door open and looking triumphantly round at Mr. Pickwick, "there's a room." Mr. Pickwick's face, however, betokened such a very trifling portion of satisfaction at the appearance of his lodging, that Mr. Roker looked for a reciprocity of feeling into the countenance of Samuel Weller, who until now had observed a dignified silence. "There's a room, young man," observed Mr. Roker. "I see it," replied Sam with a placid nod of the head. "You wouldn't think to find such a room as this in the Fardington Hotel, would you?" said Mr. Roker with a complacent smile. To this Mr. Weller replied with an easy and unstudied closing of one eye, which might be considered to mean either that he would have thought it, or that he would not have thought it, or that he had never thought anything at all about it, as the observer's imagination suggested. Having executed this feat and reopened his eye, Mr. Weller proceeded to inquire which was the individual bedstead that Mr. Roker had so flatteringly described as an out-and-outer to sleep in. "That's it," replied Mr. Roker, pointing to a very rusty one in the corner. "It would make any one go to sleep, that bedstead would, whether they wanted to or not." "I should think," said Sam, eyeing the piece of furniture in question with a look of excessive disgust, "I should think poppies was nothing to it." "Nothing at all," said Mr. Roker. "And I suppose," said Sam, with a sidelong glance at his master, as if to see whether there were any symptoms of his determination being shaken by what passed, "I suppose the other gentlemen as sleeps here are gentlemen?" "Nothing but it," said Mr. Roker. "One of 'em takes his 12 pints of ale a day, and never leaves off smoking, even at his meals." "He must be a first-rater," said Sam. "A one," replied Mr. Roker. Nothing undaunted even by this intelligence, Mr. Pickwick smilingly announced his determination to test the powers of the narcotic bedstead for the night, and Mr. Roker, after informing him that he could retire to rest at whatever hour he thought proper, without any further notice or formality, walked off, leaving him standing with Sam in the gallery. It was getting dark, that is to say, a few gas jets were kindled in the place, which was never light, by complaint to the evening which had set in outside. As it was rather warm, some of the tenants of the numerous little rooms which had opened into the gallery on either hand had set their doors ajar. Mr. Pickwick peeped into them as he passed along with great curiosity and interest. Here 4 or 5 great hulking fellows, just visible through a cloud of tobacco smoke, were engaged in noisy and riotous conversation over half-emptied pots of beer, or playing at all fours with a very greasy pack of cards. In the adjoining room some solitary tenant might be seen poring, by the light of feeble tallow candle, over a bundle of soiled and tattered papers, yellow with dust and dropping to pieces from age, writing for the 100th time some lengthened statements of his grievances, for the perusal of some great man whose eyes it would never reach, or whose heart it would never touch. In a third, a man with his wife and a whole crowd of children might be seen making up a scanty bed on the ground or upon a few chairs, for the younger ones to pass the night in. And in a fourth, and the fifth, and a sixth, and a seventh, the noise, and the beer, and the tobacco smoke, and the cards all came over again in greater force than before. In the galleries themselves, and more especially on the staircases, there lingered a great number of people who came there, some because their rooms were empty and lonesome, others because their rooms were full and hot, the greater part because they were restless and uncomfortable, and not possessed of the secret of exactly knowing what to do with themselves. There were many classes of people here, from the labouring man in his fustian jacket to the broken-down spendthrift in his shawl dressing-gown, most appropriately out at elbows. But there was the same air about them all, a listless, jail-bird, careless swagger, a vagabondish who's-afraid sort of bearing, which is wholly indescribable in words, but which any man can understand in one moment, if he wish, by setting foot in the nearest debtor's prison, and looking at the very first group of people he sees there with the same interest as Mr. Pickwick did. "It strikes me, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, leaning over the iron rail at the stair-head, "it strikes me, Sam, that imprisonment for debt is scarcely any punishment at all." "Think not, sir?" inquired Mr. Weller. "You see how these fellows drink and smoke and roar," replied Mr. Pickwick. "It's quite impossible that they can mind it much." "That's just the worry thing," rejoined Sam. "They don't mind it. It's a regular holiday to them, all porter and skittles. It's the other ones that gets done over with this sort of thing, them downhearted fellows as can't swig away for the beer nor play at skittles neither. Them as would pay if they could, and gets low by being boxed up. I'll tell you what it is, sir. Them is always idling at public houses. It don't damage at all. and them as isn't always a working when it damages too much. It's unethical, as my father used to say, when his grog weren't made half and half. It's unethical, and that's the fault on it. I think you're right, Sam, said Mr. Pickwick after a few moments' reflection. Quite right. Perhaps now and then there's some honest people as can likes it, observed Mr. Weller in a ruminative tone, but I never heard of one as can call to mind except a little dirty-faced man in a brown coat, and that was force of habit. And who was he? Inquired Mr. Pickwick. Why, that's the very point as nobody never knowed, replied Sam. But what did he do? Oh, why, he what many men has been much better known has done in their time, sir, replied Sam. He ran a match against a constable and won it. In other words, I suppose, said Mr. Pickwick, he got into debt. Just that, sir, replied Sam, and in course of time he come in consequence. That weren't much execution for £9 nothing, multiplied by 5 for costs, but however so, here he stopped for 17 year. If he got any wrinkles in his face, they was stopped up with the dirt, for his dirty face and brown coat was just the same at the end of the time as they was at the beginning. He was a wery peaceful, inoffending little creature, and was always a bustling about for somebody or playing rackets and never winning, till at last the turnkeys they got quite fond on him, and he was in the lodge every night a-chattering with him and telling stories and all that air. Fun night he was in there as usual, along with a wary old friend of his as was in the lock. Then he says all of a sudden, I ain't seen the market outside, Bill, he says. Fleet Market was there at the time. I ain't seen the market outside, Bill, he says, for 17 year. I know you ain't, said the turnkey, smoking his pipe. I should like to see it for a minute, Bill, he says. Wery probable, says the turnkey, smoking his pipe, wery fierce and making believe he warn't up to what the little man wanted. Bill, says the little man, more abrupt than before, I've got a fancy in my head. Let me see the public streets once more afore I die. And if I ain't struck with apoplexy, I'll be back in 5 minutes by the clock. And what'd become of me if you was struck with apoplexy, said the turnkey. Why, says the little creature, whoever found me'd bring me home, and I've got my card in my pocket, Bill, he says. Number 20, coffee room flight. And that was true, sure enough, for when he wanted to make the acquaintance of some newcomer, he used to pull out that little limp card with them words on it, and nothing else, in consideration of which he was always called number 20. And the turnkey takes a fixed look at him, and at last he says in a sullen manner, 20, he says. I'll trust you. You won't get your old friend into trouble. No, my boy, I hope I found something behind here, says the little man, and as he said it, he hit his little waistcoat very hard. And then a tear started out of each eye, which was very extraordinary, for it was supposed as water never touched his face. He shook the turnkey by the hand. Out he went. And never came back, said Mr. Pickwick. Wrong for once, sir, replied Mr. Weller, for back he come 2 minutes afore the time, a-billing with rage, saying how he'd been nearly run over by a hackney coach, and he warn't used to it, and he was blowed if he wouldn't write to the Lord Mayor. They got him pacified at last, and for 5 years after that he never even so much as peeped out of the lodge gate. At the expiration of that time he died, I suppose, said Mr. Pickwick. No, he didn't, replied Sam. He got a curiosity to go and taste the beer in the new public house over the way, and it was such a very nice parlour that he took it into his head to go there every night, which he did for a very long time, always coming back regular about a quarter of an hour before the gate shut, which was all very snug and comfortable. At last he begun to get so precious jolly that he used to forget how the time went or caring at all about it, and he went on getting later and later until one night his old friend was just shutting the gate and turned the key. In fact, when he come up, "Hold hard, Bill," he says. "What, ain't you come home yet, 20?" says the turnkey. "I thought you was in long ago." "No, I wasn't," says the little man with a smile. "Well then, Tell you what it is, my friend, says the turnkey, opening the gate wery slowly and sulky. It's my opinion as you've got into bad company o' late, which I'm wery sorry to see. Now, I don't wish to do nothing harsh, he says, but if you can't confine yourself to steady circles and find yourself way back at regular hours, as sure as you're a-standing there, I'll shut you out altogether. The little man was seized with a violent trembling, and never went outside the prison walls afterwards. As Sam concluded, Mr. Pickwick slowly retraced his steps downstairs. After a few thoughtful turns in the painted ground, which, as it was now dark, was nearly deserted, he intimated to Mr. Weller that he thought it high time for him to withdraw for the night, requesting him to seek a bed in some adjacent public house, and return early in the morning to make arrangements for the removal of his master's wardrobe from the George and Vulture. This request Mr. Samuel Weller prepared to obey with as good a grace as he could muster, but with a very considerable show of reluctance nevertheless. He even went so far as to essay sundry ineffectual hints regarding the expediency of stretching himself on the gravel for the night, but finding Mr. Pickwick obstinately deaf to any such suggestions, finally withdrew. There is no disguising the fact that Mr. Pickwick felt very low-spirited and uncomfortable, nor for lack of society, for the prison was very full, and a bottle of wine would at once have purchased the utmost good fellowship of a few choice spirits, without any more formal ceremony of introduction. But he was alone in a coarse vulgar crowd, and felt the depression of spirit and sinking of heart naturally consequent upon the reflection that he was cooped and caged up, without a prospect of liberation. As to the idea of releasing himself by ministering to the sharpness of Dogson and Fogg, it never for an instant entered his thoughts. In this frame of mind he turned again into the coffee-room gallery and walked slowly to and fro. The place was intolerably dirty, and the smell of tobacco smoke perfectly suffocating. There was a perpetual slamming and banging of doors as the people went in and out, and the noise of their voices and footsteps echoed and re-echoed through the passages constantly. A young woman with a child in her arms, who seemed scarcely able to crawl from emancipation and misery, was walking up and down the passage in conversation with her husband, who had no other place to see her in. As they passed Mr. Pickwick, he could hear the female sob, and once she burst into such a passion of grief that she was compelled to lean against the wall for support, while the man took the child in his arms and tried to soothe her. Mr. Pickwick's heart was really too full to bear it, and he went upstairs to bed. Now, although the warden's room was a very uncomfortable one, being in every point of decoration and convenience several 100 degrees inferior to the commonest infirmary of a county jail, it had at present the merit of being wholly deserted, save by Mr. Pickwick himself. So he sat down at the foot of his little iron bedstead to begin to wonder how much a year the warden made out of the dirty room. Having satisfied himself by a mathematical calculation that the apartment was about equal in annual value to the freehold of a small street in the suburbs of London, he took to wondering what possible temptation could have induced a dingy-looking fly that was crawling over his pantaloons to come into a close prison when he had the choice of so many airy situations, a course of meditation which led him to the irresistible conclusion that the insect was mad. After settling this point, he began to be conscious that he was getting sleepy, whereupon he took his nightcap out of his pocket, in which he had had the precaution to stow in the morning, and leisurely undressing himself got into bed and fell asleep. Bravo! Heel and toe, cut and shuffle, pay away it zephyr. I'm smothered if the opera house isn't your proper hemisphere. Keep it up, hooray! These expressions, delivered in a most boisterous tone, and accompanied with loud peals of laughter, roused Mr. Pickwick from one of those sound slumbers which, lasting in reality some half hour, seemed to the sleeper to have been protracted for about 3 weeks or a month. The voice had no sooner ceased than the room was shaken with violence, that the windows rattled in their frames, and the bedsteads trembled again. Mr. Pickwick started up, and remained for some minutes fixed in mute astonishment at the scene before him. On the floor of the room, a man in a broad-skirted green coat with corduroy knee-smalls and grey cotton stockings was performing the most popular steps of the hornpipe, with a slang and burlesque caricature of grace and lightness which, combined with the very appropriate character of his costume, was inexpressibly absurd. Another man, evidently very drunk, who had probably been tumbled into bed by his companions, was sitting up between the sheets, warbling as much as he could recollect of a comic song with the most intensely sentimental feeling and expression, while a third, seated on one of the bedsteads, was applauding both performers with the air of profound connoisseur and engaging them by such ebullitions of feeling as had already roused Mr. Pickwick from his sleep. The last man was an admirable specimen of a class of gentry which never can be seen in full perfection but in such places. They may be met with in a perfect state occasionally about stable yards and public houses, but they never attain their full bloom except in these hotbeds, which would almost seem to be considerately provided by the legislature for the sole purpose of rearing them. He was a tall fellow with an olive complexion, long dark hair and very thick bushy whiskers meeting under his chin. He wore no neckerchief, as he had been playing rackets all day, and his open shirt collar displayed their full luxuriance. On his head he wore one of the common 18-penny French skull caps, with a gaudy tassel dangling therefrom, very happily in keeping with the common fustian coat. His legs, which, being long, were afflicted with weakness, graced a pair of Oxford miniature trousers made to show the full symmetry of the limbs. Being somewhat negligently braced, however, and moreover but imperfectly buttoned, they fell in a series of not the most graceful folds over a pair of shoes sufficiently down at heel to display a pair of very soiled white stockings. There was a rakish vagabond smartness and a kind of boastful rascality about the whole man that was worth a mine of gold. This figure was the first to perceive that Mr. Pickwick was looking on, upon which he winked to the Zephyr and entreated him with mock gravity not to wake the gentleman. "Why, these bless the gentleman's honest heart and soul," said the Zephyr, turning round and affecting the extremity of surprise. "The gentleman is awake. Shakespeare, how do you do it, sir? How is Mary and Sarah, sir? And the dear old lady at home, sir? Will you have the kindness to put my compliments into the first little parcel you're sending that way, sir? And say that I would have sent 'em before, only I was afraid they might be broke in the wagon, sir. Don't overwhelm the gentleman with ordinary civilities when you see he's anxious to have something to drink," said the gentleman with the whiskers and a jocose air. "Why'd you ask the gentleman what he'll take?" "Dear me, I quite forgot," replied the other. "What will you take, sir? Will you take to port, sir, or sherry wine, sir?" "I can recommend the ale, sir, or perhaps you'd like to taste the porter, sir. Allow me to have the felicity of hanging up your nightcap, sir." With this, the speaker snatched the article of dress from Mr. Pickwick's head and fixed it in a twinkling on that of the drunken man, who, firmly impressed with the belief that he was delighting a numerous assembly, continued to hammer away at the comic song in the most melancholy strains imaginable. Taking a man's nightcap from his brow by violent means, and adjusting it to the head of an unknown gentleman of dirty exterior, however ingenious a witticism in itself, is unquestionably one of those which come under the denomination of practical jokes. Viewing the matter precisely in this light, Mr. Pickwick, without the slightest intimation of his purpose, sprang vigorously out of bed, struck the Zephyr so smart a blow in the chest as to deprive him of a considerable portion of the commodity which sometimes bears his name, and then, recapturing his nightcap, boldly placed himself in an attitude of defence. "Now," said Mr. Pickwick, gasping no less from excitement than from the expenditure of so much energy, "come on, both of you, both of you!" And with this liberal invitation the worthy gentleman communicated a revolving motion to his clenched fists by way of appalling his antagonists with a display of science. It may have been Mr. Pickwick's very unexpected gallantry, or it might have been the complicated manner in which he had got himself out of bed and fallen all in a mass upon the hornpipe man that touched his adversaries. Touched they were, For instead of then and there making an attempt to commit manslaughter, as Mr. Pickwick implicitly believed they would have done, they paused, stared at each other for a short time, and finally laughed outright. "Well, you're a trump, and I like you all the better for it," said the Zephyr. "Now jump into bed again, or you'll catch the rheumatics." "No malice, I hope," said the man, extending a hand about the size of a yellow clump of fingers, which sometimes swings over a glover's door. "Certainly not," said Mr. Pickwick, with great alacrity, for now that the excitement was over, he began to feel rather cool about the legs. "Allow me the honour, sir," said the gentleman with the whiskers, presenting his dexter hand and aspirating the H. "With much pleasure, sir," said Mr. Pickwick, and having executed a very long and solemn shake, got into bed again. "My name is Smangle, sir," said the man with the whiskers. "Oh," said Mr. Pickwick. "Mine is Mivins," said the man in the stockings. "I am delighted to hear it," said Mr. Pickwick. "Ahem," coughed Mr. Smangle. "Did you speak, sir?" said Mr. Pickwick. "No, I did not," said Mr. Smangle. "Oh, I thought you did, sir," said Mr. Pickwick. All this was very genteel and pleasant, and to make matters still more comfortable, Mr. Smangle assured Mr. Pickwick in a great many times that he entertained a very high respect for the feelings of a gentleman, which sentiment indeed did him infinite credit, as he could be in no wise supposed to understand them. "Are you going through the court, sir?" inquired Mr. Smangle. "Through the what?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Through the court, Portugal Street, the court for relief, you know." "Oh, no," replied Mr. Pickwick. "No, I am not." "Going out, perhaps," suggested Mivins. "I fear not," replied Mr. Pickwick. "I refuse to pay some damages, and am here in consequence." "Ah," said Mr. Smangle, "paper has been my ruin." "A stationer, I presume, sir?" said Mr. Pickwick innocently. "Stationer? No, no, confound and curse me, not so low as that. No trade. When I say paper, I mean bills." "Oh, you wouldn't use the word in that sense, I see," said Mr. Pickwick. "Damme, a gentleman must expect reverses," said Smangle. "What of that? Here am I in the Fleet Prison. Well, good. What then? I'm none the worse for it, am I?" "Not a bit," replied Mivins. And he was quite right, for so far from Mr. Smangle being any the worse for it, he was something the better, inasmuch as to qualify himself for the place, he had attained gratuitous possession of a certain article of jewellery which, long before that, had found their way into the pawnbroker's. "Well, but come," said Mr. Smangle, "this is dry work. Let's rinse our mouths with a drop of burnt sherry. The last comer shall stand it, Mivins shall fetch it, and I'll help drink it. That's a fair gentlemanlike division of labour now. Curse me!" Unwilling to hazard another quarrel, Mr. Pickwick gladly assented to the proposition, and consigned the money to Mr. Mivins, who, as it was nearly 11 o'clock, lost no time in repairing to the coffee-room on his errand. "I say," whispered Smangle, the moment his friend had left the room, "what did you give him?" "Half a sovereign," said Mr. Pickwick. "He's a devilish pleasant, gentlemanly dog," said Mr. Smangle. "Infernal pleasant. I don't know anybody more so, but—" Here Mr. Smangle stopped short and shook his head dubiously. "You don't think there is any possibility of his appropriating the money to his own use?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Oh, no. Mind, I don't say that. I expressly say that he's a devilishly gentlemanly fellow," said Mr. Smangle. "But I think perhaps if somebody went down just to see what he didn't drop his beak into the jug by accident, or make some confounded mistake in losing the money as he came upstairs, it would be as well. Here, you, sir, just run downstairs and look after that gentleman, will you?" This request was addressed to the little timid-looking, nervous man whose appearance betook great poverty, and who had been crouching on his bedstead all the while, apparently stupefied by the novelty of the situation. "You know where the coffee-room is," said Smangle. "Just run down, tell the gentleman you've come to help him up with the jug. Or, stop, I'll tell you what, I'll tell you how we'll do him," said Smangle with a cunning look. "How?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Send down word that he's to spend the change in cigars. Capital thought. Run and tell him that, d'ye hear? They shan't be wasted," continued Smangle, turning to Mr. Pickwick. "I'll smoke 'em." This manoeuvring was so exceedingly ingenious, and withal performed with such immovable composure and coolness, that Mr. Pickwick would have had no wish to disturb it, even if he had had the power. In a short time Mr. Mivins returned, bearing the sherry, which Mr. Smangle dispensed in 2 little cracked mugs, considerately remarking, with reference to himself, that a gentleman must not be particular under such circumstances, and that for his part he was not too proud to drink out of a jug. In which, to show his sincerity, he forthwith pledged the company in a draught, which half emptied it. An excellent understanding having been by these means promoted, Mr. Smangle proceeded to entertain his hearers with a relation of divers romantic adventures in which he had been from time to time engaged, involving various interesting anecdotes of a thoroughbred horse and a magnificent Jewess, both of surpassing beauty, and much coveted by the nobility of gentry of these kingdoms. Long before these elegant extracts from the biography of a gentleman were concluded, Mr. Mivins had betaken himself to bed, and set in snoring for the night, leaving the timid stranger and Mr. Pickwick to the full benefit of Mr. Smangle's experiences. Nor were the 2 last named gentlemen as much edified as they might have been by the moving passages narrated. Mr. Pickwick had been in a state of slumber for some time, when he had a faint perception of the drunken man bursting forth afresh with a comic song, and receiving from Mr. Smangle a gentle intimation, through the medium of jug water, that his audience were not musically disposed. Mr. Pickwick then once again dropped off to sleep, with the confused consciousness that Mr. Smangle was still engaged in relating a long story, the chief point of which appeared to be that on some occasion, particularly stated and set forth, he had done a bill and a gentleman at the same time. End of chapter 41.